Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just wrapped up talking about the Warriors and their decision to have Klay Thompson come off of the bench for them. Now we are going to be moving on to the Timberwolves, who I think had just about as big of a week as anybody in the NBA. They just last night blew out the Portland Trail Blazers, and if your thought is, well, that's the Portland Trail Blazers, I agree. But, I think it's not so much just about that game alone. It's about just the way that they ended off this streak going into the All-Star break last night. I mean, they outscored the Timberwolves 44-14 in the first quarter, and after letting them sort of crawl back through the next couple quarters, it became an 8-point game in the third quarter. The Wolves responded with a 9-0 run and just didn't look back from there. So they enter the All-Star break with a 4-game win streak under their belt. All of these games coming on the road for them. And really, it was 2 huge statement wins against the Milwaukee Bucks and the LA Clippers. Again, both of these coming in their arenas. And we saw their defense staggering a little bit. The defense has been the calling card for them for just about all season, but it was sort of staggering a little bit at times. I mean, we saw them blow the game to the Chicago Bulls just last week, but they have been back to sort of themselves, and especially in these big games against the Clippers and the Bucks, able to shut down these opposing offenses. We talked about how the Bucks have been staggering themselves a little bit on the offensive end, but we still know the ceiling that they have. The Wolves were able to shut them down then. And then I think that the holding of the Clippers to just 100 points in their game on Monday was just about as impressive of a performance as you can ask for. The Clippers were trying to run their small ball lineup against Gobert. If you remember, a couple years ago, it was sort of the Clippers who exposed Gobert a little bit with going with these small lineups and trying to pull him out of the paint more and limiting how effective he is. But I think that we've seen himself be able to improve in some of those scenarios to be a little bit, he's not a lockdown defender on the perimeter, but he can hold his own a lot more this year than he has been able to in the past. And, teams are trying it because they've seen it happen in a big moment in the past, and it's almost giving him a little bit of this extra experience for trying to do so. And we also sort of talked about this with the Clippers sometime earlier this week. It was when we touched on them, and the fact that with these small ball lineups, they're not quite as effective with Russell Westbrook in them because of the fact that he can't shoot. So you sort of just stick Gobert in these scenarios on the worst shooter on the court and adjust from there. But I think that defensively, he's been able to hold his own a lot more in those instances. He's the front runner for Defensive Player of the Year right now because of his presence, obviously, in the paint. And then I think also when it comes to this small ball conversation, I think that he's also done a better job of being able to take advantage of the smaller matchups on the offensive end, where you saw him, being a little more aggressive. And you don't want him necessarily decision making, but just take what's in front of you. It's offensive rebounds and putbacks. He had a dunk over Kawhi in that game, where don't try and get too cute. Don't try and, go to the post up, but you have the natural size matchup. Just let the offense flow as it does and then capitalize in those moments. And that's what I saw from him in that game against the Clippers that I was a fan of, because we just see this Timberwolves team as a whole really figuring out how to play with one another after a little bit of a messy fit last year in terms of figuring out how to sort of do this whole thing with this too big lineup. And, they're paying Naz Reid, of course. They extended him this offseason, but they're paying this other center as well. And you're the nucleus of your offense is this young wing in Anthony Edwards, and he's still figuring out sort of his highs and lows. And I just feel like they look a lot more complete as a team. And it's also interesting because when you consider Rudy Gobert, he's going to be a Hall of Fame player, whether you like his play style or not. The defense that he provides, the Defensive Player of the Year awards, he is going to be a Hall of Famer. He, yes, had Donovan Mitchell with him on the Jazz, a very young Donovan Mitchell, and a Jazz team that really wasn't expected to be anything all too spectacular until we saw Mitchell come in, provide the scoring that he could, and the team having the anchor of Gobert in the paint to play defense for them. And, I think that a lot of that Jazz strategy was tailored for Rudy Gobert getting what he wants. He gets a certain designated amount of post touches despite not being a very nuanced offensive player in the post, and defensive schemes were all centered around him. And now you see there's a lot more mouths to feed. You have a couple different offensive players that are more talented than you are for that. Anthony Edwards, of course, Karl Anthony Towns at your own position being a better offensive player. And Naz Reid, I love Naz Reid. The way that he's able to stretch the floor and what he's able to do. He's probably a better offensive player than Rudy Gobert is. So I think that it was a little bit of an ego thing as well for Gobert trying to settle into this Timberwolves team off rip. And now we've seen him sort of go through a level of maturity that makes him a better player. It's something that we see with, every single player for the most part in NBA and in sports history, really, is sometimes you have that little bit of an ego check. So that's sort of my notes on Gobert there. The offense is what's really been sticking out to me through this road trip. And again, a little bit of a small sample size, just 5 games, but they were 4-1 on it. They blew the really bad game to the Bulls, where it was their defense that let them down in that one. But they win their last 4 games of the road trip heading into the All-Star break. They scored 124.4 points per game on that road trip. And their offense has been pretty subpar for the year as a whole. I think there's some very interesting clutch numbers when it comes to this offense and whether or not when the game slows down, they have the shot creators, the shot makers, the IQ really to play a smart brand of basketball. You see Karl Anthony Towns earlier this year getting benched in the clutch with 62 points because he was sort of so caught in his own head in the lack of maturity. And I think maturing is a big part of, both sides of the court for this Timberwolves team, as we just sort of talked about with Gobert as well. But the Timberwolves have been, still are, outside of the top 15 in offensive rating for the season as a whole. In their past 10 games, though, they have a 120.8 offensive rating, which is 5th in the NBA in that span. So, a lot of it has been Anthony Edwards just taking his game to another level. He's been so incredible. I love watching this guy, and he's just a menace for opposing defenses when he's fully locked in like that. He's a menace on defense as well when he is being asked to step up into that role. But last 2 games of this road trip just killed the Blazers, and I thought the composure, obviously you're playing the Trailblazers, so it's not like the level of difficulty is really all there too high, but I thought that specifically the game on Tuesday night, coming off of second day of a back-to-back, coming off of a big emotional win against the Clippers the night prior. If you remember that Clippers game, it was close at halftime. The Clippers went on a run to close that first half, really make this thing a game, and the Clippers come out in the third quarter and just run the Clippers off the court, where the Wolves put up 40 points in that third quarter, help them carry the lead into and through the rest of the game. And then Tuesday, you have this game against the Trailblazers. Again, we just sort of looked at what happens when you overlook a team with the Milwaukee Bucks that we talked about earlier in the show, overlooking the Grizzlies and end up getting upset. The Wolves, I should say, in this instant, come into Portland where, definitely easy to overlook them. This was a tie game in the fourth quarter, but their offense, again, was the one. I mean, their defense was still good throughout that game as well, but their offense was just a little bit slow to start that one. They explode down the stretch of the game. Nickeil Alexander-Walker was phenomenal for them down the stretch of that game as well. Anthony Edwards finishes with 40 points, giving energy on both sides as well. So I just feel like, the composure that's there, and Anthony Edwards, to that note, has just been so crucial for this team, being able to, he can get a little immature at times talking about the refs. He gets caught up in that as well. There was some interesting quote about him talking about trying to add a left-handed jumper to one up Michael Jordan and all of that. And, he gets sort of caught up in the fun of the game, but I mean, that's a better thing than disassociating from the game itself and just sort of treating it more so as a hobby than, the actual thing that he's working for. He's extremely competitive, so much so that he's trying to, one up Michael Jordan. It's really fun stuff to see from Anthony Edwards. He is definitely, in my opinion at least, on pace for his first ever All-NBA appearance. So we'll obviously see how that plays out. The Wolves didn't really make all too many moves at the trade deadline. They added Monte Morris as a backup point guard. I like Monte Morris a lot. He wasn't getting much playing time in Detroit, in a team that was trying to get some of their younger players more playing time and more opportunities and all of that. He hasn't played much for Minnesota very much so far, only 15 minutes a game in those 3 games, but maybe they're just trying to work him back into it, considering the lack of workload that he held in Detroit. I mean, this Timberwolves team could definitely benefit from having some more accessible options for their point guards. They were relying on Jordan McLaughlin a lot earlier this year. Shake Milton never really panned out as far as the backup point guard they were hoping that he could be. So they bring in Morris, who I've always, again, liked. I think that he's just steady and reliable. And again, with this team that sometimes is, I wouldn't call them off the rails or anything, but the moment gets a little fast for them and they get very excitable. I think that Morris could find himself sort of sliding into a role where he's more of a calming presence for this team. But, ultimately, the championship doesn't lie on the shoulders of Monte Morris. It is with that starting group. It's with Anthony Edwards. It's with their bigs. Very Mike Conley reliant right now. And Mike Conley is a phenomenal player. But just at his age, it's, it's just something to watch for, especially because I think their other starter in Jaden McDaniels, incredible defender. Don't think he's a very good decision maker. So, again, a lot sort of falls on the shoulders of Conley to initiate the offense. And again, their crunch time offense in clutch games hasn't been incredible. So, especially against some of the other really good defenses, it's one thing to do it against a Portland. And, the Clippers aren't even that great of a defense, really, but they were able to escape even getting into that close game because they were playing so fluidly through the third quarter and all of that. They were able to build up a sizable lead that it never got all too contested. But I think that the Timberwolves need to win some of those games first before, we can really call them any sort of favorites. Again, definitely in contention. They are the 1 seed in the Western Conference. They have the second best record in the NBA. But there are still a couple things we probably would like to see from them going forward before we, crown them by any means. But that is all I have on them. So we are going to be taking our final break. When we come back on the other side, we will be talking about a historic night last night with Caitlin Clark. So stick with us. We will be right back.